Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the National Gallery and to today's talk. My name is Rosalind McKeever, and I'm the Harry M. Weinreeb Curatorial Fellow for Post-1800 Paintings. I'm so glad to see so many of you have joined today to take the opportunity to look and to think about Paul Cézanne's large bathers. And I say look and think, because with Cézanne, you can't do one without the other. Cézanne is interested in sensations, both the physical sensations of the world and how we perceive it, and how they combine with our internal sensations. So I want you to think about this as you're looking at the picture, as you're thinking about it, and thinking whether or not you like it. I imagine, given that you've come to hear me talk for half an hour about it, that you like it. I'll take that as my starting point. So what do I mean looking and thinking, looking and feeling at the same time? I'll give you an example. I am looking at this painting while at the same time as being stood in front of a large group of people who are looking at me. Maybe, therefore, I feel some empathy with these women in the picture that are being looked at. But at least I'm getting to talk. Maybe you, as the audience, as you're looking at this with cameras behind you that are looking over your heads, much like these women who are being viewed from behind for the most part, and you're there silent, having to listen to me, maybe you feel some empathy or not with these figures. Maybe something that's happened in your day, something that's happening in the room is affecting your looking. You're not looking without thinking. So if we're thinking in terms of, do we like this picture? It's interesting for me to go back to 1964 when the gallery first bought it, as this caused a bit of a scandal. People weren't happy that the gallery had paid so much money for this picture. And the cause of their consternation was that it was an imperfect representation of the female form. And I want you to think about this too, is how well Cézanne is giving you an illusion of space, an illusion of bodies, affecting whether or not you like this picture. And Cézanne is rather divisive on this front. In 1905, a year before Cézanne died, in an art journal in Paris, the question was asked, what do you make of Cézanne? And people gave rather contradictory answers. He was either an emptier of cesspits, or he was the originator of modern painting. And that's an interesting point in relation to the figuration, the representation we see here, and the beginnings of abstraction we see here, and where we are stood now. We are in room 41 of the National Gallery, which at present contains the most modern pictures that we have in our collection. We're actually at the southeast edge of the National Gallery, looking at paintings from around 1900. If you want to see paintings made after this, made later than this, in Britain's national collections, you have to go about 1.5 miles through this wall to Tate Modern. And so when we talk about painting before and after Cézanne, there is a very physical boundary in this sense. It's interesting that I always think of this painting as the end of the story that our collection tells of painting in the European tradition. But if you go to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, it is with a Cézanne's bathers that they traditionally begin their story. So this is really an artist at painting's crossroads. And in this room, if you look around you, you'll see other artists from this period. We have, to the wall over there, late Monet, and the wall opposite, we have Picasso and Matisse, painters of the avant-garde, painters who you'd expect to be iconoclastic, painters you might not expect to find, as it once was, in a museum. But Cézanne is a little different. Cézanne, for me, is a museum painter par excellence. And I'll come back to explain why. So, a little on Cézanne to get us going. So, Paul Cézanne is born in Provence in the south of France in 1839. His father, who you can see in the large painting over there, wanted Cézanne to go to law school. Cézanne, however, wanted to be an artist, so he goes to Paris. The painting to the left of his father probably shows Cézanne's studio in Paris in 1865. And in Paris, he met up with an old childhood friend. He just happened to be childhood friends with Émile Zola, the great champion of Manet, the great writer and champion of Manet. And so Paul Cézanne gets a rather good entree into the modern art world of Paris, but he completely does not fit in. He does exhibit in 1874 with the artists who came to be known as the Impressionists, and this association was very important for him in that Camille Pissarro, one of the Impressionists, encouraged him to start painting on plein air, outdoors, and it also really lightened his color palette. So if you look at the two Cézannes I've mentioned on that wall, they're both very dark, but the rest of this wall behind me is all Cézanne, and you'll see that it's much lighter, it's much fresher because of that relationship with the Impressionists. However, Cézanne said that he had very different goals to the French Impressionists. He said that he wanted to make of Impressionism something solid and durable, like the art of museums. And this is where we see Cézanne going beyond Impressionism. This is why we refer to him as a post-Impressionist, because he has these very different goals. Although the word post-Impressionism was only coined in 1910, 4 years after his death. This is a very late Cézanne painting, although it was painted over a long period, started around 1894, finished 1905, so the year before his death. Now, as you can work out from those dates, Cézanne was not a quick painter. The Impressionists were famous for painting quickly. Cézanne, although this is a rather extreme case, is known for painting slowly. He's very slow and methodical. He takes his time. He's looking and very carefully transferring his sensation of something he sees, so both the external feeling and the internal feeling, into one of his little brushstrokes. And you'll see in most of the pictures along this wall these very particular little diagonal marks that he's making to build up, to construct a picture rather than necessarily to draw a picture. And because of this approach, because it takes him a long time to make a picture, we might be surprised to see bathers here. You'll notice the other pictures, we have the one painting of his father, but otherwise we have still lives and landscapes. Because still lives and landscapes don't move. They don't get bored of you painting them, they don't fidget, they don't get up and walk out of the studio because you're taking too long. So it's really a surprise then that we see Cézanne painting human figures. And what's surprising is that he does this throughout his career. From the 1870s through to the end of his life, he is painting bathers. He makes nearly 200 scenes of bathers, both male and female. And this is one of 3 large bathers, called large bathers literally because the canvases are bigger. And the others are in the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the Barnes Museum, which is also now in Philadelphia. So what do you do if you want to paint people, but you want to spend a long time doing it and they won't stay still? You go to the museum, because there you have an incredible storehouse of bodies, of figures, of poses that you can borrow, steal, however you want to phrase it, and include in your works. And this is what the young Cézanne does. He goes to the Louvre and he makes sketches of classical sculpture. He makes copies of old master painting. And he takes all of these forms and puts them in to his compositions. Often he does so in disguise. Often it's quite hard to figure out where he's taken something from. But we think this figure on the right-hand side here with her arms forward is taken from a Venus in the Louvre, and this woman lying on her front could be taken from the sleeping Hermaphroditus, a sculpture also in the Louvre. But he's not just taking these figures from the museum, he's taking more. He takes from the museum, from the Louvre, from what he sees there, a challenge, a visual challenge. How do you represent the physicality, the solidity of the human body in the open airiness of a landscape? And who sets him this challenge are the artists of the Venetian Renaissance. So artists like Giorgione and Titian, who are making these scenes. Now in them, so for example with Giorgione, you get these scenes that are very, still to us today, very mysterious. They have little clues in them that suggest that some kind of narrative is going on, but we maybe haven't figured out yet what's happening. But sometimes with Titian, you get a very clear narrative as to why a whole group of women are in a landscape, apart from the obvious, which we'll come back to. You get figures of Diana, and famously we have in our collection, but currently not on display as they're in Scotland, the Titian's painting of Diana and Callisto, where we see Diana with her all-female entourage, who we might associate with this picture here. You also, in the Louvre, if you're looking for figures in a landscape, find yourself with the French painter Nicolas Poussin, who's actually working in Rome, who's interested in more Arcadian scenes, these sort of rural utopias of figures in a landscape. But we don't have Venus here, we don't have Diana, we don't have necessarily an Arcadian scene, although that's questionable. We have a 19th century picture of a period when modern life was supposedly your subject. Now, I say that because bathers is a theme that was popular with the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists and Neo-Impressionists before Cézanne. So 25 years before Cézanne started this picture, Monet painted a scene of bathers, which you can find a couple of rooms down in the National Gallery. And 10 years before Cézanne started this, you can see actually in the next room, a painting by Seurat of bathers. But Cézanne's is very different. And I don't know if any of you have spotted this yet, but there is no water in this scene of bathers. Towels, yes. An implication of bathing, yes. But where on earth is the water for these women to bathe in? Now, in the version of this picture in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the women are sort of divided in the center. So you have a bit of space here, you have a strip of water going across the middle. So they're not bathers. In the version in the barns, you get a sort of picnic situation in the front. I mean, we've got some what seem to be apples here, slightly like the still life that we'd expect from Cézanne. But we don't seem to have much narrative. And this is quite different, especially the lack of water. When Monet paints bathers, you get the feeling that he doesn't really care much for the bourgeois Parisians who have escaped the city of Paris for a day just to bathe, to bob around in the waters of the Seine. With Seurat, you get a sense he cares a little more about the weary workers who sit in the industrial outskirts of Paris, ready to bathe in that same river. But here, you're very confident that the water is not the key to what we're looking at. So if we have no signs of modern life, we have no water, we have some towels and a few oranges. What is our story here? Who on earth are these women? And what on earth are they doing here? And this is what makes this painting so intriguing and also problematic. We don't have a sense of their expressions, really. The woman here, we get a sense that she's looking out at us, but not necessarily that she's seeing us. And the rest of the women are looking down. They're not interacting with each other at all. In fact, because of how crowded the space is, it almost feels like they're not in the same space. It's really like a collage of figures of female flesh that he's taken out of the Louvre and sort of smashed together here. He's treating them like objects. He's treating them like he treats a still life. But it would be naive to think of these pictures in the same way we think when we talk about Titian or someone else. It would be naive to think of these forms as just a stand-in for some oranges. These are nude female figures who are being looked upon, who are being painted for a period of over 10 years by a male artist. That cannot be unseen. However, it was not on these grounds that in 1964 the British press took offense to this picture, well as they might. It was, as I said at the beginning, this imperfect representation of female form. It feels like the British press would be happier if Cézanne had painted the Rokeby Venus. So, what's the problem here is that the British press have slightly missed the point. Because as much as offended as we may be that he's done so, Cézanne is really interested in form. He wants to turn everything, be it a living, breathing woman or not, into the cylinder, the cone, and the sphere. And that's what he's doing here. He's really breaking these down as objects. And in doing so, he's fusing the landscape and the figures. And this is where I come back to this visual challenge that was set to him by the Venetian Renaissance, in that he, rather than trying to separate landscape and figure, he's really fusing them together. This is maybe most obvious over here with the woman leaning forward, who her figure is so aligned with the tree that she almost becomes it, but at the same time, we have half a sense that she is in front of the tree. It gives a slight inclination of space. And I encourage you to look very closely at the spaces in between the figures, the spaces where there should be air, but there's not. These are actually the most worked up bits of the canvas. You can really see him laying on the paint, working these up in this dark blue. They're stifling in that sense. And this blue, that's the dark blue of the sky, that is not in any sense pushed back as you might expect it to be in a landscape. It's really pushing forward into the same plane as these women. And then below, you have the same blue in their outline, which is creating both a sense of flatness, but then also he's using the tradition of using blue to shade the edges of the human body to give a sense of three-dimensionality and at the same time a sense of flatness. Now, that has an incredible consequence for art history. That's why we're at the edge here, and we're at the end of this story. And this is why many subsequent generations of artists called Cézanne the father of modern art. Matisse, whose work, as I said, is opposite us here, actually bought a Cézanne Bathers in 1899, so about halfway through this one being painted. He bought another smaller version of the Bathers, and he really took from that this idea of color as dimension. He took lessons of flatness and surface. And in 1907, the year after Cézanne died, his work was exhibited at the Salon d'Automne in a large retrospective. And that was visited by Picasso and Braque, on whom this was very influential. So if you think of the Demoiselles d'Avignon, a painting by Picasso from the very same year, 1907, that's a work that shows us standing and squatting women in this very compressed space. And he's painting it in the time that he sees this work for the first time. Braque too takes from Cézanne an interest in form, and he takes very literally. He ends up going to L'Estaque, where Cézanne painted, and Braque paints the forms there, paints the landscape, and breaks it down into little cubes. And when an art critic sees those little cubes, he calls it cubism. And that's the beginning of the story of modern painting, very much seen as coming from this. The last modern artist I'll cite for you is actually a sculptor, a great sculptor of the female figure, Henry Moore. And Moore said of this picture when he saw it in the 1920s, "If I were asked to name the 10 most emotionally intense visual moments of my life, this would be one of them." And I think that's an interesting quote, because he calls this, he says, the 10 most emotionally intense visual moments. So emotion and visuality together. The thing that Cézanne was really working towards is the thing that completely Henry Moore picks up from it. And I want to leave you with that, and with this thought of the relationship between what you see and what you feel. Because Cézanne, for the reasons I've outlined, became an incredibly important painter for all of these formal visual breakthroughs that he makes. But then he becomes, in the second half of the 20th century, a very problematic artist for us because of the emotional side of things, which the formalists would have us completely ignore, and we just look at how incredibly visual he's made these pictures. But if we're looking at Cézanne on his own terms, then you have to remember to both look at how important this work is formally at the same time as how you feel about it emotionally. So I don't know if you feel the same way about it that you did at the beginning. I don't know if you're thinking the same things or if you're seeing the same things, but I do hope that this talk at least was enjoyable. Thank you very much.